Hello, my name's Peter Whitehead, and this is one of a series of talks I've developed for the U3A Bromley Branch Art Appreciation Group during lockdown. This is a group of people who enjoy art, are enthusiastic about it, but we're not really experts, but we just like to share whatever we've found out about various aspects of art. And this talk is about surrealism, particularly about surrealism as a movement and what its aims were. I think surrealism is too large a subject to focus in one talk on all the various artists who adopted it, but the talk comes from a feeling that I've always known what a surrealist painting looks like, without ever really appreciating the concept of surrealism. So this is the structure of the talk. First of all, what is surrealism? How did the art world arrive at the point? About the origins, how surrealism was created, the ideas that underpin it and the techniques that were used, a section on surrealist objects. There was quite a strong strand of English surrealism, so we'll look at that briefly, and it was also a movement which attracted many female artists in the mid-20th century, so we'll look at some of those as well, and then we'll see what influences it had later on. So the first thing to look at is, what is surrealism? André Bresson, who's the author of this manifesto of surrealism in 1924, is the kind of self-appointed father and guardian of surrealism. The basic idea is that surrealists wanted to access the imagination through the subconscious and abandon any rules associated with morals or acceptable behaviour. So they're trying to express the actual functioning of thought in the absence of any control. Surprisingly, for a movement which sought to disregard conventions, there were a whole host of rules in the manifesto about what you could and couldn't do. The other key point in this definition is that it applies to all means of expression. Initially, surrealism was a literary movement, terms first used in 1917 in connection with poetry. So surrealism can apply to a whole range of output, which are all shown here, and some of the surrealist artists spanned several of these genres. Salvador Dali, for instance, was a painter who also collaborated on films. There is a political agenda to surrealism. It's a movement of the left wing. It's revolutionary, it's anarchistic, it's associated with Trotskyism. It doesn't support what it would call bourgeois art, the art of, I suppose you'd say, the middle classes. These associations made the artists, the surreal artists, vulnerable with the rise of fascism in the 1930s, and the opposition to bourgeois art saw artists such as Miró and Ernst expelled from the group for a while for daring to design sets and costumes for a ballet. That was not what surrealism was about, and Dali designed clothes, merchandise, a pavilion at the 1939 New York World's Fair, all of which was actually not really acceptable to the pure surrealists. The whole movement, of course, is centred on Paris, like much of the art world in the 1920s and 30s. So there were two key influences on surrealism. The first is the Great War. The shock to society generally from this cataclysm, I think, is a bit difficult for us to appreciate, but there was clearly the view that the world had changed as a result of the war, and there was no going back to the pre-war era. A civilization which had allowed such a horror was not tenable and was discredited. And Max Ernst said, "We young people came back from the war in a state of stupefaction, and our rage had to find expression somehow or other. This it did quite naturally through attacks on the foundation of the civilization responsible for the war." And we'll see that some of the surrealists had a very direct link with the Great War. The other key influence is Sigmund Freud, who you can see in the photograph here with his cigar. His work on the subconscious and dreams was very influential in a number of realms, not just in psychology, in art, in music, in literature. And surrealism was one of the ways in which Freud's theories were brought to the attention of the wider public. And the public found it slightly shocking. It brought to attention all that had previously been repressed. So Freud was very much about sexuality, about violence, all of these things that he thought existed in the subconscious, but which the conscious mind repressed, sometimes with disastrous consequences. But in some respects, surrealism has been around or in development for centuries. So this is a painting, I think it's actually a triptych, this is just the central panel, by Hieronymus Bosch of the late 15th century, a Flemish artist, I think you'd call him. It's called The Garden of Earthly Delights. It might be considered as a morality tale. It's a kind of warning. If you behave in this way, horrible things will happen to you. But the garden that he's painting here is populated by all sorts of strange, nightmarish creatures and imagery. If we look at one of the panels in detail, this is the right hand panel called the Tree Man, and you can see disembodied ears, a knife, three naked persons sit at a table in the torso cavity, sitting on an animal, and a woman pours drink from a barrel. All this, I think, has some commonality with surrealism, although obviously Bosch had no understanding of Freud or anything like that, but he does seem somehow to be operating in a subconscious or dreamlike world, or perhaps the world of the trance. The Romantic movement from about 1800 had introduced emotion and imagination into art, and the Surrealists certainly built on that, but they were also influenced by later movements. Arnold Böcklin, whose self-portrait we see here, was one of the symbolists, and the symbolists in around the 1870s had introduced hidden meaning to art through the use of metaphor and symbols, and this was a reaction against realism and naturalism. So you have the realist movement from about 1840, and then the symbolists say, well, we don't just want to paint what we see, we want to put some meaning into it. So the self-portrait here in the background, though it's a almost classical self-portrait of a painter at his work, but over the painter's shoulder we see in the title a figure called Death playing the fiddle. Personally, I've always associated the violin with the devil. In many folk tales, the devil finds a violin and its music irresistible. So perhaps it's more likely to be the devil. But anyway, Berkeley, I presume, thought it was death that he was portraying there. If you know the poem by Andrew Marvell, at my back I always hear time's winged chariot hurrying near. That's the type of message that you get from this painting. Berkeley was Swiss, and symbolism, like other movements at this time, like realism, like romanticism, it's a cultural movement that affects poetry, philosophy and music as well as art. Another influence on the surrealists were primitive or naive painters such as Rousseau, who painted with a very simplified form and line. This kind of simplicity and the almost tribal elements of the painting of artists such as Rousseau were also inspiring Cubism at the time. As well as appreciating so-called primitive or naive art, the surrealists also valued art produced by what were then called insane people, because both categories represented the untrammeled expression of unconscious impulses. So they're all spontaneous. There's no mediation in what you see in the art. It's the straight into the artist's imagination. Cubism itself was highly influential to the surrealists. Picasso himself, whose drawings you can see here, was never formally part of the surrealist movement. There were too many rules and regulations attached to surrealism for him. But, you know, there was a lot of mutual admiration. He was never convinced by something we're going to look at in a minute, which is automatism. So the automatic production of art. Picasso's works were always carefully planned. And the Cubists rendered figures and objects as geometric forms. And Picasso challenged traditional notions of space and representation in art. And you could break down and rearrange natural forms into geometric shapes. This created this kind of a new reality of fractured spaces, and which was very energetic. These figures were published in the surrealist periodical Minotaur in 1933. They are, if you look closely at them, they are 6 human figures, and if you look very closely you can tell which ones are which sex. But at the same time, they are geometric shapes, they are household objects, all that would appeal to the surrealists. But the immediate predecessor of surrealism is Dada. World War I had arisen in a rational and elitist culture. What Dada aimed to create, and this was started in Zurich in about 1916, in the middle of the First World War, was an alternative culture that championed the absurd, the irrational and the spontaneous. It was subversive, it could be cynical, and it could be nihilistic. It was opposed to bourgeois values, it was anti-nationalist. And this is, you know, the start of the reaction caused by the First World War. The First World War had arisen in a society that was supposed to be culture, but how could cultured society produce the devastation that was the First World War. Obviously the culture itself was fatally flawed. This is where the Dadaists came from. Duchamp here, Master Duchamp, his fountain, he produced things that he called ready-mades, sometimes creations of chance rather than craftsmanship. Art could be produced by making the viewer look at everyday objects in a different way. And of course what you're looking at here is a urinal, sideways on, and Duchamp subverts that by saying, well, actually it's a fountain. So all this had created the environment in which surrealism could arise. This is André Breton, 1896 to 1966, and he published the Surrealist Manifesto in 1924. But Surrealist ideas had been around since 1917, when the term was coined by the French poet Guillaume Apollinaire, and he actually put a hyphen in it, so it was surrealism, so in French above realism or beyond realism. But when Breton used the term, he joined all that together. Breton was one of the people who'd been influenced by the First World War. He'd in fact served as an orderly in a psychiatric ward in World War I, so he'd seen the psychological damage that the war had caused. And many movements at this time, art movements, had a manifesto. The Dadaists had a manifesto, the Symbolists had a manifesto. It was a book of rules, essentially. As I said, originally very much a literary movement, and about free association. The subtitle of the manifesto there, Poisson soluble, is translated as soluble fish, a fish that dissolves in water, which is obviously an impossibility. But this was a kind of poetic or literary part of the manifesto. I can read you a bit of it, luckily in English. This is how it starts. At that time of day, the park spread its pale hands above the magic fountain. A castle without meaning travelled over the earth's surface. So what the surrealists in the literary sense were trying to do was to produce a poetry of irrational juxtapositions. You just put ideas together that didn't necessarily make any rational sense, but produced a sort of beauty by the rhythm of the words. Now, originally art was thought to be hopelessly compromised and not amenable to surrealist thought or theory. In particular, if you had this free association and just free flow of ideas, that didn't really sit very well with the production, certainly of oil paintings. They had to be more carefully thought out. But there were artists who'd been developing along surrealist lines. This is the Italian artist Chirico. He was a Greek of Italian parentage. He produced images based on Renaissance architecture and ancient Tuscan sculpture. He called them metaphysical paintings. The free association of images, they are ambiguous meanings and the surprising combinations of form. He would stretch and bend spaces, giving them an elastic quality, and sometimes they look warped. In this painting, The Enigma of a Day, the foreshortening of the colonnade makes it look larger and deeper. The lighting is very harsh. It's a bit dreamlike. In the place of where you might expect to see a classical sculpture, you've got a modern figure, and then you have these tiny figures in the background, and then in the distance, two factory chimneys, are they? we don't really know. Someone else who had started developing surrealist ideas before the publication of the manifesto is Max Ernst. His dates are 1891 to 1976. He started life as an expressionist painter. He studied philosophy at the University of Bonn in 1909, intending to specialise in psychiatry. But he had a traumatic experience in the German army in World War I, which I quoted from him earlier. He helped found the Dada art movement, and he used both free association and dream-like images, as he does in this painting called Salib, I think is how you pronounce that. So you have a combination here of an elephant. There's obviously an elephant type figure, but there's also a metal tank in this figure, and both of them are captivating, being beckoned by a headless female figure. The landscape is very barren and perhaps warlike. The elephant figure comes from a photograph that Ernst saw of a Sudanese corn storage bin. Is this an airfield as well? Because if you look in the top right of the painting, is that a aircraft spiraling down with a plume of smoke having been shot out of the sky? You just have to look at these paintings and form your own conclusion about what they are. This is another painting by Max Ernst, The Equivocal Woman. Something that the Surrealists picked up, fantastic machines that parody the human body and human behaviour. So the woman here seems to be part of the machine. She's looking at something, whatever she's seeing is making her hair stand on end. And you have the machine has its own legs, which one of her legs is in close contact with. And again, two pillars in the background, a bit like the Kiriko. And Ernst also was aware of the work of Freud, obviously, because he'd studied psychiatry. He was aware of Freud's development of the Oedipus complex, the son's rivalry with the father for the affections of the mother. So he merges that here with the Pieta pose. So if you think of Michelangelo's Pieta in St. Peter's, where the dead Christ is cradled by Mary, you almost replicate that pose here with a father. I think that's meant to be Ernst's father in the background, on his knees holding his son. Ernst and his father actually had a very difficult relationship. His father was a devout Catholic, and Ernst, like all the Surrealists really, was an atheist and very opposed to religion, especially Catholicism. So these are some painters who are around at the very early stage of Surrealism. But I said we'd have a look at some of the ideas and techniques that support Surrealism. So the first one is automatism. So this is about free drawing and almost like doodling, and using that as a basis of the development of ideas. So you just put lines on a paper almost without any thought. You remove the conscious element, and that produces what they would have called automatic drawing, which then could be developed into a work of art, and we'll see some of that. Also applied to, in the literary field, irrational juxtaposition. So putting unconnected ideas or items together was a key function of surrealism. We've mentioned a lot that the subconscious was really important to them, and how did you access that? Well, you could access it, as Freud thought, through dreams or hypnosis, but you could also access it if you put yourself into a trance. And some surrealist artists actually starved themselves until they hallucinated, and those hallucinations formed the basis of their artwork. But eventually two distinct strands of surrealism developed. One linked to the automatic or free drawing, and the other is technically called oniric, which just means dreamlike. So the surrealist paintings that look as if they're created in a dream are one strand. The automatic drawing is very much more abstract, I feel, but the dreamlike drawings tend to use imagery which you can recognize. Though you might not understand the context, you can always recognize what it is generally that's being portrayed. So the first strand, automatism. André Masson produced this in 1924, called automatic drawing. The issue is that oil paint is not really a medium which is conducive to automatic painting. It's much more effective if you use a pen which moves freely across a page, creating a random series of lines, and these lines can then be used to develop an idea or subject. So I, in this drawing, can see elements of figures. You may well be able to see something else. For the surrealist, it doesn't really matter. There's eyes, there's limbs, there's fingers I can see in this. Perhaps you see something else. Délire végétal, vegetable delirium. So again, this is spontaneously drawn, the swirling, curving pen strokes are meant to suggest leaves, seeds, vegetable forms. There are random angles, seeing straight lines. So this resembles early cubism, in which figures and objects are broken down into geometric shapes, but unlike cubism, as I said earlier, this is not pre-planned. This is just almost free form stream of consciousness type of activity. Masson also had another technique which is sand painting. So what you see here is a paper. The paper would be covered with random blobs of glue. Then sand would be shaken onto that paper, and you can see that where the sand is, and those forms then be used to create an artwork, what they suggest. So the sand on the left hand side to me suggests a mountain, Everest, but obviously to Masson he thought this was a seascape, and he's drawn in fishes fighting each other with elements of blood. So this is a primeval world where life struggles for existence. The fishes are fighting each other for existence. The surrealists were quite influenced by works of literature. There's a book that's very important to them called Les Chants de Maldoror, the songs of Maldoror. And in this book, the hero Maldoror is shipwrecked and sees a great shoal of sharks battling over human bodies. And there's a suggestion that this story also influences this painting by Masson, or this drawing, this artwork by Masson. The other important painter associated with automatism is Joan Miró. He's born in Barcelona, 1893. His early work is Fauvist or Cubist, but each individual object in the painting has a symbolic meaning. The paintings are biomorphic, so they are almost geometric representation, in this case of a human figure, and objects are abstracted into simplified, brightly coloured curving shapes. So what we see here is a woman in her fan-shaped skirt, and she has a child feeding at each breast, and all this floats in a bluish space, which could be sea or sky. Miró is the painter who in 1925, by this stage, is fueling his choice of subject by hallucinations. He said in 1925, by this time I was living on a few dried figs a day. Is deliberately, I think, to starve himself and to produce this kind of trance-like state. And this painting, Harlequin's Carnival, captures the hallucinations caused by hunger. It's highly symbolic. The black earth, the black circle represents the earth. The black triangle that you can see through the window is the Eiffel Tower, as seen from Miró's Paris studio. There are cats, there are insects in the apartment. There is music playing, which you can see through musical notes that are floating in the apartment here, and characters seem to be dancing, but it's all very much, although it's a carnival atmosphere, the painting, the title of the painting tells us that. It's also a very disturbing, almost nightmarish scenario, which I think you would have to look at for a long time to try and extract all the elements that Miró is putting into this work. Another painter in the Oniric tradition, or the tradition of dream-like representation, which we're moving to now, is Magritte. He paints clear figures, unlike Miró, we've just seen, where you have to interpret what those figures mean. We can see what is happening here. We've got two figures, one on the left holding the cudgel. The figure in the centre is listening to the gramophone. There's a murdered or dead woman lying on a chaise longue, and in the background there's three heads looking into the room. And the figure listening to the gramophone has his suitcase packed and his hat and coat ready to leave. Magritte painted in a very witty style. He used everyday objects in an absurd way. This painting is actually based on a popular thriller series, a series of short stories, I think they were, called Fantomas. Fantomas was a Raffles-like master criminal who was always able to escape the traps laid for him by the police. So what we see here is the assassin, which is the more or less central figure. He's listening to music beside the corpse of his victim, while the captors gather round him with a club and the figure on the right is holding a net. They're going to try and capture him, and his escape route via the window or door in the background is blocked by three figures. But we know, because it's Fantomas, he is going to escape. He is unconcerned. He's listening to music. He's murdered a woman. That's unimportant. He will escape the menace that is being offered to him here. And one of the most well known, I suppose, images by Magritte, the Treachery of images here. This is not a pipe, is what it says. So there is a painting of a pipe, and that's a statement of fact that what you are looking at is not a pipe. It is a painting of a pipe, and a painting of a pipe cannot be a pipe. So what Magritte is having fun with here is the relationship between real life and representation. All realistic, so-called realistic representation is an illusion, and there is this kind of philosophical side to Magritte's art. So around about this point in the late 1920s, a young chap called Salvador Dali appears on the scene. He's not one of the founders of Surrealism, although I think most people would think that he is the driving force in Surrealism. He certainly becomes one of the dominant forces. He's actually, if you look at his dates, he's when Surrealism is founded, he's probably too young to have any influence. But the one thing you can say about Dali is that he's a superb self-publicist, and I think, I mean, I'm certainly old enough to remember seeing film of him or appearances by him on chat shows or something, and you always got the impression that everything he did was an act. He was acting the role of Salvador Dali. Who knows what the real Salvador Dali was like, and perhaps he didn't by the end of his life. An interesting quote from him. Dali said, "The only difference between myself and a madman is that I am not mad." So he is able to behave like a madman without suffering from the causes of madness. And that links back to something I said earlier, how the Surrealists were very interested by art produced by the mentally compromised, and how madness removed a layer of restraint and convention and allowed a closer access to the subconscious. And Dali was very interested in symbolism, very interested in the unconscious mind. He arrived in Paris in 1929, and he's very much in the oniric school of Surrealism, so the dreamlike school. And what he was trying to do was to render the world of the unconscious with as much conviction as possible. Eventually, his celebrity status caused a rift with other purer surrealists, and he kind of drifted away from the movement. This is probably his best known painting, I think, The Persistence of Memory. So we have a landscape near his home in Spain. The painting was meant to have been inspired by Dali eating after dinner one night a very soft camembert cheese, and you get the feeling that these clocks could easily be made of camembert. They're melting, and Dali uses this to create a symbol of the melting and ambiguous nature of time, especially in dreams and memory. So we have this eternal landscape, the figure in the center, which has a human form. You can see eyelashes there. And the ants on the left, ants are a very common feature of Dali's work, is all about decay and death. But the objects themselves are recognisable. They are realistic, figurative objects in an abstract composition. And the softness of the objects, symbols of decay and entropy. And Dali had an obsession with the nature of time, with memory, with time, with the passage of time. This is something that features very often in his work. But he also used the technique of irrational juxtaposition to produce what he called surrealist objects. And they're almost, it's not a sculpture, it's might be considered a three-dimensional collage, which is meant to be, and is, in Dali's words, absolutely useless from the practical and rational point of view. A telephone, which he actually produced for one of his friends to have in his apartment. The user speaks into the tail or the sexual parts of the lobster, while the claws menace his head. And I think that's one of the most, again, probably best known of the surrealist objects produced by Dali. There were sculptors who adopted surrealist ideas, and Giacometti here, who later moved on to other form and developed his own style in 1935, is producing what might be considered a three-dimensional form of Miró's biomorphism. The work was inspired by chance. In a flea market in Paris, he discovered a mask, which is the face of this particular object, and it's slightly unclear what the mask was for. It might have been for gas protection during World War One, but anyway, the mask inspired Giacometti to produce this work. The figure is holding something that is invisible. From the front, you might think that it's sitting in a chair, but from the side, you get a different perspective. So the whole work is inspired by, say, masks that you would find in Polynesian culture, Egyptian funerary sculpture. I always think it looks quite a lot like if you've been to Greece and seen the so-called death mask of Agamemnon in gold, which was found in Mycenae. I think that has a lot of similarity with the mask-like face of this object. So you're combining the real and the unreal. And as I said, Giacometti, after this, kind of moved away from surrealism, but is obviously much influenced by it here. Max Ernst continued to paint in the surrealist style. The Republicans were defeated in the Spanish Civil War, and Ernst, I think, represents this. This is a clumsy figure which is devastating everything that gets in its way. There's a Spanish style landscape devoid of features or life. The pose is scary, but slightly in a childlike or comic way, and it is slightly suggestive of the imperial eagle beloved of the fascists. Ernst himself was interned as an enemy alien by the French in 1939, and then arrested by the Gestapo in 1940. So it's not surprising that he later escaped to the United States, helped by Peggy Guggenheim, of the well-known Guggenheim family, who he married later on. The height of Surrealism may well have been the 1938 Exposition Internationale du Surrealisme in Paris. In this exhibition, visitors were totally immersed in a world of sight, sounds and smells. The main room was designed by Duchamp to represent a darkened cave, and visitors had to use a torch to see artworks on the walls. Dali produced an ivy-covered taxi. There were what were described as sexually provocative mannequins, and recordings of harsh laughter and smells of coffee and coal dust were projected into the exhibition space. And works from all around the world were exhibited here. So by 1938, Surrealism has become a global phenomenon. There were works from Czechoslovakia, Romania, the United States, Egypt and Japan, all surrealist. And surrealism had also developed in this country. There was an exhibition in 1936 in London. Henri was on the organising committee along with Paul Nash. This painting, The Winged Domino, it was inspired by Penrose's first wife, the poetess Valentine Bouet, and you can see that jewel-like butterflies feed at her mouth and eyes as if on nectar. Roland Penrose is actually quite an important figure who probably deserves a bit more attention. So he was knighted, and he later went on to found the Institute of Contemporary Art, the ICA, in the Mall. He set that up. So this is an English form of surrealism. And by this time, I think the dreamlike side of surrealism had taken over from the automatic drawing side, partly through the influence of Dali, I think. This is something by Paul Nash, A Harbour and Room, and he contributed to the 1936 International Surrealist Exhibition in London. You see here there is a room, there is a view, but there is perspective that doesn't work. There's a smaller building on the right hand side, the interior on the left hand side, the view through to a harbour, but it doesn't work altogether. It's a mishmash of different perspectives and sizes. The Surrealists had a number of very significant female members. Claude Cahun here was born Lucy René Mathilde Schwab in 1894. They moved to Paris in 1920 and adopted the sexually ambiguous name of Claude Cahun. The print here is a reference to Narcissus. Narcissus is the chap in Greek mythology who is entranced by his own reflection in a pool and spends all his time looking at his own reflection in this pool until he's turned into a plant, into a narcissus. And Freud argued that homosexuality was a form of narcissism. The love of self meant that the homosexual was unable to form relationships with the opposite gender. And that's the sort of concept that this print is playing with illusion and identity. There are masculine and feminine elements to the print. The mirror is the mirror image, but Narcissus is not looking at himself, he's looking at us. So if you thought gender was an issue and transgenderism was an issue that was a relatively new phenomenon, well, you go back just under 100 years, it's still being tackled by the surrealists. Actually, Cahun is almost challenging the Freudian ideas here. Surrealists tended to use the female image, or male surrealists anyway, as a symbol of male fantasies and frustrations. The female was to be seen either as an object of desire or as an object of danger. And the female surrealists actually challenged that. And there are early feminist and gay sensibilities in the work of the female surrealists. This Leonora Carrington, whose dates are 1917 to 2011, when Leonora Carrington died. She was the daughter of a wealthy English industrialist. She'd been presented at court in 1935. A common theme amongst the lady surrealists is actually that they have a romantic relationship with Max Ernst, who seems to get around a bit. So this self-image that Carrington is producing here is a contradiction. So she's wearing jodhpurs and riding boots, her hair is wild, but she's contained in a room. The horse behind her is a rocking horse, so through the window you can see a white horse free. So Carrington presents herself as an independent woman who is actually struggling against Victorian ideas of womanhood. The room is very stark, it's almost like a prison. The emotional scape comes through the rocking horse and the horse seen through the open window. And there's this eerie female hyena in the room with her, Carrington's alter ego, a savage beast, against the very refined and conventional woman who sits on the chair. Dorothea Tanning, an American artist, who, surprise, surprise, also marries Max Ernst. They married in 1946. Originally, Dorothea Tanning was a fashion designer, a fashion illustrator for Macy's department store. And what we see here are like the Narcissus in Claude Cahun's print. It's a reversal of a Greek myth. This one, the myth of Daphne. Daphne, to escape the attentions of Apollo, was turned into a laurel tree. But the opposite is happening to Tanning. It looks here. She is emerging from the tree, not turning into it. You can see in the painting countless doors, open doors. There's a kind of labyrinthine quality to those. There's this strange winged furry creature in front of her. Is that her alter ego, and is that going to lead her through the maze? The figures are very lifelike. They merge realism with myth and ambiguity, and this is very typical of surrealism, that you have realistic image. Those doors couldn't be anything other than doors. They're very domestic as an interior, and then juxtaposed with those you have the very fanciful and inexplicable figures like the furry creature with wings, which you are left to interpret your own device. But Surrealism was really ended with the Second World War. Many artists fled to the United States, where they certainly influenced the development of the New York art scene. People like Jackson Pollock used surrealist ideas to create abstract expressionism. Pop art used the surrealist objects technique, and surrealism really dies with André Breton when he dies in 1966. But there are one or two later influences, and I want to end with this building in Prague, the Nationale building. built in 1992 to 1996, and it's an influence of Surrealist influence on architecture. And what enables this to happen is actually computer design technology. Before computer design technology, you could not have designed a building like this, but it is a Surrealist influence on architecture. You've got organic curving lines in the building. The towers seem to be dancing together, and actually in Prague, this building is nicknamed Fred and Ginger, for Fred Astaire and Ginger Rogers. The two towers seem to be dancing together, but it's slightly incongruous when you look at the architecture around, but that building could easily have featured in any Surrealist painting. Well, that's the end of our introduction to Surrealism. I've hoped it's whetted your appetite and that you go on to have to explore more works of Surrealism. Thank you for listening.